Welcome to Voices of Experience. I'm Dan Mikel, the President Emeritus of the Minnesota State Retiree Council, AFL-CIO, and today we'll be discussing the Minnesota budget crisis of 2011. And our guest today is Brian Rusche, the Executive Director of the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition, and we'll be looking at the economic forces that have led to our state shutdown. Viewers may recognize Brian's name as he has had major op-ed pieces in the Star Tribune and in other places. Brian, welcome to Voices of Experience.
Oh, good to be here. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Okay. Before we start talking about the budget crisis and the state shutdown, let's just tell our viewers who and what the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition is.
Sure. It's an interfaith public policy group, and it is governed by Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Islamic leaders and religious organizations in the state of Minnesota. And so we work on social justice issues from a faith perspective, from an interfaith perspective.
Okay, that's quite a combination that you have there. And,
when we were founded, it was the Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish communities, and then in 2004, the Muslim community joined our coalition as well.
Okay, and how long ago was the JRLC established?
Conversations began in 1968, and it took several years of dialogue and negotiations, and they formulated a charter in 1971.
And how long have you been the executive director?
22 years. I've done 23 legislative sessions, yeah.
So you started when you were 12 or 15 years old.
Right.
Okay. I went to your website, jrlc.org.
Right.
And I read that carefully, and on that website is you have listed 8 core values
right.
that are guiding principles.
Right.
And I noticed that your most recent op-ed piece in the Star Tribune, which appeared in the summer, earlier in the summer of 2011, deals with human dignity.
Right.
And that's one of your core values.
Right.
Could you tell us what you mean about human dignity and how it fits into the budget crisis of 2011?
Sure. Well, first of all, that core value, I think, is probably the primary value that the 4 faith groups share. Human dignity is just almost foundational. It's our starting point, that we believe that people are made in the image of God and have an unassailable worth and dignity. So human dignity drives all our thinking. In the article, in the op-ed piece, I was talking about compromise and the need for state leaders to compromise in order for this budget stalemate to get solved. And it occurred to me that whenever people compromise, whether it's you and your spouse or you and a neighbor, or if it's political leaders or police encountering people in a fight and have to mediate, there's always some sort of what I would call a transcendent value, or some value that the parties who are arguing can still hold in their heads and in their hearts as being more important than the dispute that they're having. And so I tried to think about what is it in this budget partisan struggle that we're having over the state budget that is transcendent, that everybody can say, regardless of how I have put my feet in cement about the budget, what do I still regard as a primary principle? And I think it's human dignity. And we have to be thinking, as I said in the article, about the consequences of policy changes and how these changes land on people. What kind of pain do we inflict on people? What kind of services do we withhold? What kind of work doesn't get done? How do we move forward as a state if we don't have human dignity as kind of the first principle to bring us together? So I argued in the piece that really should be more of a navigating star, if you will, than any particular number in the budget debate.
A North Star for the North Star state, so to speak.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay. Besides the budget situation, could you just tell us quickly what are some of the other specific policy issues that is of interest to the Joint Religious legislative coalition?
Yeah, generally you would, I think, put them under the umbrella of social justice, social and economic justice. The other key thing about JRLC is we only work on those issues where the four groups can find agreement. But our history has been around things like minimum wage, job training, job policy, public assistance, anti-hunger legislation, services to lift up the lives of people with disabilities. We've been active in reasonable gun regulations. Back early in our history, we were responsible or partly responsible for the 5-day waiting period and handgun registration, that sort of thing. Tax fairness has always been important to us, and I know we'll talk about that later. Health care, access for everyone to have good, affordable health care. Housing, kind of the basic needs of people is really central to our work. And then we also say quite a bit about our government and what makes for good government. So we've been active in campaign finance issues, election issues, and so forth.
You are a 501c3,
right?
Which means?
Well, we're actually connected corporately to the Minnesota Council of Churches, so we operate under their 501c3 status. And the amount of lobbying that we do is not a significant portion of the combined budgets of the four sponsors. So we do lobby, but it's not the major part of the expenses of these groups. So the issues have been, varied over the years. We cover a pretty broad range. But the one thing that I think is kind of interesting about us is our board has always been eager to go where the power vacuum is. Where, who isn't well represented? Who doesn't have a big budget to to hire lobbyists and that sort of thing? So we always try to put our resources on those issues where we think some group of people may be harmed if we're not there.
Okay. And to keep current on your activities, our viewers can connect to the Express newsletter.
Right.
That's through the website?
Yeah. If people go on our website, there's a place to sign up for our newsletter, and they give us, fill out a form with their email, and then we'll put them on the list.
Very good. Okay, we'll come back to JRLC a bit later, but let's start talking about taxes and the budget situation in Minnesota. So I've known you for a few years now, Brian, and you know that I taught secondary social studies for 35 years and civics or econ. And in my classes, I used to quote U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., who said, taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society.
Right.
Taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. My question for you, first question, how civilized are we? How much of a civilized society do people in the state of Minnesota have?
Well, there's I think a glass half full and a glass half empty kind of answer to that. When you compare Minnesota to the rest of the country and around the world, we're pretty civilized. Most of the ways that you measure quality of life, whether that's longevity or health status, per capita income, access to recreation, clean water, air, those kinds of things, Minnesota scores pretty high. So we're pretty civilized. We do a lot of things well here. And I think part of the tradition is that we've been willing as a people to support good public services that support the quality of life that we've had. On the other hand, to take the glass half empty approach, there's some things in Minnesota that are really disturbing. The number of people living in poverty, for example, the number of people who do not have or can get living wage jobs, our health status and income status for people of color is embarrassingly bad. We have some of the largest disparities. Our averages look good, but that kind of masks the disparities of the lives of people of color in many instances. And we still have, I think, a long ways to go in making sure that kids are ready to learn when they show up in kindergarten. So there's a lot of work to do. I don't think we're as civilized as we could be. We're very wealthy people, comparatively speaking. But you know, it's kind of like, how do you want to start from looking at the ideal and how much better we could be, or do you want to look comparatively and pat ourselves on the back?
How does our taxes compare to other countries of the world?
Yeah, I was really surprised by something that I saw. It was in December. I think it was the December issue of The Economist magazine. I was at an airport and happened to pick up that issue, and I was reading a table in the back page that showed all of the developed nations of the world. I think the OECD, Organization for Economically Developed Countries, published this data. And the United States was about in the middle of the list, which surprised me. And then on the sidebar, there was a commentary that said, you know, the United States is a lightly taxed country.
Yeah.
So people that have an international business perspective look at the United States as a fairly lightly taxed country compared to the other economically advanced countries. And so we're not overtaxed. You know, deep in our DNA, I guess, is this idea that, you know, taxes are oppressive, and we have all kinds of, you know, Tea Party type demonstrations and movements and expressions of distaste for taxes. But the fact is, we're lightly taxed in this country, and we're also incredibly efficient with how much we get in terms of our public services for the taxes that we do pay.
Okay. And on a state level, if we zone in on Minnesota, how does the state of Minnesota tax package or structure compare now? I'll shift the comparisons a little bit.
Yeah.
How it compares now to what it was 10 years ago, for example?
10 years ago, well, it was in 1999 and 2000, so just a hair over 10 years ago, we made some pretty dramatic tax cuts. And those pretty much benefited people at the top end of the income scale. So they're paying less than they did 10, 11, 12 years ago. But the other, I think, notable shift is if you look at the pie that shows where the state's general fund monies come from, the property tax is a much bigger piece of the pie now than it was back then. So we've kind of shifted away from income tax and more onto property tax, which is a less fair tax.
When you say the top end of the income, what is your definition of top end? How much money?
Yeah, we're talking about roughly 150,000 and over would be the top 10%. 150,000 of income a year, gross household income.
Okay, so it's more than I ever.
The top 5% would be over 200,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned property taxes, and that's one of the three major types of taxes on which the state of Minnesota depends. And we have property taxes and sales taxes and income taxes.
Yeah.
So let's look at let's look at a couple of those. What's happened to property taxes in the last 8 years?
They've gone up significantly.